Hello and welcome to Chapter 12 of Intro to Psychology. This is our last series of lectures for this course and part 2 on the series on social psychology. In this video, I'll be talking about prejudice and discrimination, how these concepts relate to the field of social psychology. So we began the semester by talking about the Milgram obedience experiment, a famous experiment conducted by American social psychologist Stanley Milgram, in which he tested people's ability to follow an authority figure and administer electric shocks. And so when this study was first advertised, it was advertised as a study of memory. He hid the real purpose of this study, which was actually a study of human obedience, how willing regular people would be to follow the commands of an authority figure. And so the participants were recruited to administer a test to a Confederate, who in this picture is the learner, who was supposed to learn a series of word pairs, and every time he or she made a mistake, the participant would administer an electric shock. And so the Confederate was an actor, and they would pretend that they were in pain because of the shocks. They would pretend that they were getting the answers wrong, and the experimenter, the authority figure, would tell the teacher to keep going. And Milgram found that 65% of participants continued to administer electric shocks until the learner was unresponsive. They were acting as if they were dead or they had been seriously harmed. And so Milgram's study was successful and scarily successful. And he concluded that individuals were willing to follow the instructions of an authority figure, even if they knew that they were causing harm to another person. And so the context of Milgram's study was in the post-World War II era. Milgram was a Jewish individual, and he was really interested in the social psychology of things that occurred during World War II, particularly the Holocaust. The world found out towards the end of the war, or in the years following the war, the atrocities that were committed in these Nazi concentration camps, the death marches, the forced labor, the starvings, all these kinds of things that were just horrific and unimaginable, particularly prior to the war, when Adolf Hitler was seen as a promising politician reviving Germany. And so these atrocities got Stanley Milgram thinking, how did these things occur? What forces allowed these atrocities to be committed? Is it that Nazis are these evil individuals who are just bent on or enjoy harming other individuals, or they're psychopathic, or they're just plain evil? Or are there some more normal social forces at work that allow regular people to put themselves in situations in which they might inflict or commit atrocities towards other people that they wouldn't otherwise in a different situation? And so Stanley Milgram's experiment was scarily successful in that it did show that regular American citizens, not evil Nazis per se, not people who had fought in the war, but just regular American citizens could inflict harm on a stranger at the command of an authority figure, even if they truly were against it, and even if they, as far as I could tell, thought they were causing great harm. And so one of Milgram's conclusions was that the key factor was agency, that many of the participants in the study would turn around and ask the experimenter, are you going to be responsible if this person gets hurt? Or, I'm just following your commands, but I'm going to put the blame on you and tell them that you made me do it. And that when people gave up agency, they essentially convinced themselves that they were able to keep going and in their minds anyway, harm this individual who was a learner. And so the context of Milgram's study was really about examining in-groups and out-groups. It was about comparing cultures. It was about, the images that we see of the concentration camps and the Nazis on TV and all the propaganda is that there are these evil individuals, whereas we, regular American citizens, that we're the good guys and that we're okay, and that, we're not the same as them. When in reality, he concluded that many of the same social forces, obeying an authority figure, looking out for yourself, that allowed the participants in his study to commit what they thought were acts of violence likely were at work in those concentration camps. And so regular American citizens are also capable of committing acts of violence just like Nazis. And what's interesting about his conclusion and the premise of his study is that it was done in this context of the mid 20th century, the post-World War II era, where there was so much going on in the world outside of psychological studies that could lead someone to the same conclusion. If you were a Black American living in the United States in the mid 20th century, or anytime since the 15th century to the 21st century, you already knew that regular American citizens were capable of tremendous evil, that it wasn't just Nazis. If you were a Japanese American living during the early World War II years, even before the United States got involved in the war, you knew from the Japanese internment camps that it wasn't just Nazis who were capable of tremendous evil. If you were a Native American during the early years of European colonialism, you knew that regular people were capable of tremendous evil. If you were a South African native during apartheid, if you were a person living in India during British rule, if you were a suffragette in the 19th century England, if you were a Tutsi during the Rwanda genocide, the list goes on and on and on. We know from history that regular people, particularly regular American citizens, are capable of tremendous evil. And sometimes we cast that blame on other people. And when that agency is displaced, or it's displaced to culture, it's displaced to other forces, and we let other people take the blame, then that evil progresses even further. James Baldwin said, a famous African-American writer, said that white people were and are astounded by the Holocaust in Germany. They did not know that they could act that way. But I very much doubt whether Black people were astounded. And I think that goes for many other marginalized groups in society, that we don't need the Milgram experiment to tell us that regular people, including you and I, are capable of tremendous evil when put in the right scenario. And so this brings us to this social psychology concept of in-groups and out-groups, that there is a tendency to have different standards of behavior or interpretation or different standards of expectations for people who are in your group, whatever that social group may be, within your race, within your class, within your favorite group or sports team fan group, within your religion, within your ethnicity or nationality, whatever your group is, there's a tendency for people to view their group as fundamentally good and others as fundamentally bad, or maybe not bad, maybe just different, and to downplay any similarities and to really emphasize the differences. You can take a look at this picture, which is a really interesting cartoon from several years ago that shows in a kind of simplistic way that many of the ways that we view people from other groups, other cultures, other sports teams, other nationalities, whatever the groups may be, that we often have a lot more similarities than we have differences, but our biases make us highlight the differences. And so in this video series, we're going to be discussing some terms. In order to understand these forces that are at work in social psychology, we're going to be examining many terms that are used to describe aspects of prejudice and discrimination. Some of these terms are confusing. Some of these terms are overlapping. There's lots of different terms that are used to describe similar constructs and ideas. And much of this will overlap not only from social psychology, but from sociology as well. The first three terms we're going to start with are stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. And so these terms reflect different dimensions of humanity and how we relate to people in other groups than our own. So a stereotype is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. Stereotypes make us see individuals in outgroups as one homogeneous or faceless entity and allow us to view members of our own in-group as very unique individuals. So if you are a Black person growing up in America who has not had many positive encounters with white people, you might overgeneralize or simplify or have a simple schema of how white people behave or what white people are like, instead of recognizing people as individuals. That's one aspect of a stereotype. A stereotype is predominantly a cognitive. So it is about your thoughts. It is about your inner beliefs. And that is something different, some related but different than what we would call prejudice, which is something that is affective. Once again, the word affective means emotion, which are, so prejudices are feelings that people have, both positive and negative, about other people, particularly as it relates to outgroups. So a perceived, it's often also described as a preconceived opinion or feeling or emotion that is not based on any reason or actual experience. It is coming from the word to prejudge, so judicial, right? So it's to prejudge. It's what I haven't experienced it yet. Before I experience it or before I get to know you, I'm going to judge you. So it's a feeling or judgment that we make about other people or other things. And then lastly, discrimination is a behavior. So it's not just a thought, not just a feeling, but it's an actual behavior that someone engages in. The unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things. So it's a behavior that advantages or disadvantages people based solely on their group membership. So in the example listed here on the slides, a stereotype about Yankee fans would be that Yankee fans are arrogant and obnoxious. A prejudiced or a prejudiced emotion or judgment would be that I hate Yankee fans. They make me feel angry. So there's an emotion that arises when you see a Yankee fan. And then discrimination would be some kind of act or behavior that unfairly targets individuals based on their, in this case, the team they support. So I would never hire someone who's a Yankee fan. I would never become friends with someone who's a Yankee fan. I like the example of hiring because we sometimes use discrimination in a mild way of, oh, I don't like to be friends with those individuals. But discrimination is most powerful when it involves a power differential, not just when it's a behavior or a preference, but when it becomes an act truly when it becomes an act of discrimination is when there's a power differential that disadvantages a certain group of the population or a certain societal entity. So to say, I won't hire individuals who belong to a particular race. I won't hire individuals of a particular sexual orientation. I won't sell or do business with people of a particular religion. Those are aspects of discrimination. And so why do prejudice and discrimination exist? They're kind of well-known aspects of society, but where do they come from? Why are they there? There's many different explanations. Some of them include social learning, normative influence, and confirmation bias. Social learning, as we learned in the previous chapter, we naturally learn from people who model behavior for us, particularly authority figures in our lives, parents, people in positions of authority, whoever it may be, teachers, politicians, other people that are propped up by society or propped up in our lives. If they are engaged in certain behaviors that discriminate or express certain prejudice feelings, then those are passed on to future generations naturally. And it's harder to break those cycles the more prevalent or the more tightly held those prejudices or the more enacted those acts of discrimination are. Also, there's normative influence. So even as you're past the stage in development where you are just taking cues from your social models, there's always normative influence where we want to behave how others around us behave, that it is reinforcing to us to behave in a way that does not deviate from the group and that promotes acceptance and avoids rejection. And so to promote acceptance and avoid rejection, in many cultures, what that looks like is targeting the outgroup. viewing the outgroup or members of the outgroup as scapegoats, as individuals who can be blamed for problems with your in-group. And then lastly, confirmation bias, which we described earlier in this course, the tendency to seek out information that supports our existing beliefs or our existing stereotypes and ignore or downplay information that isn't consistent with our stereotypes. And so in this way, confirmation bias works to reinforce any preconceived notions that we have about other people. So for example, if you grow up in a society where members of a particular religion are viewed as terrorists or are viewed as people who are trying to infiltrate the country, and then and let's say there's 10 news stories about members of that religion who are doing good things, and there's one news story about a member of a sect of that religion who commits an act of violence. We have a natural tendency to ignore the 10 good news stories and focus on the one that fits our existing hypothesis. And even if there are 100 good news stories for members of that particular religion, those existing biases, as we described in the previous chapter, are naturally reinforced even on a neurological, neurobiological level. Next in our list of terms related to prejudice and discrimination, we're going to review just three of main forms of discrimination and prejudice that are prevalent right now in society and in the news and in other aspects of our world. One is sexism. Sexism, which is prejudice and discrimination towards individuals based on their sex. So some common examples include gender role expectations or expectations for how members of a particular sex or particular gender should behave in society. For example, the expectation that women shouldn't be in the military, which was a controversial topic for many years in this country. And sexism can play out interpersonally, but can also result in some real effects in terms of employment and education opportunities in a systemic way. So for example, there's this very interesting study that showed evidence against girls and women in contexts that emphasize intellectual ability. These researchers did a series of studies that showed when you had job descriptions that emphasized intelligence or intellectual ability, and you fed those to individuals who were in hiring roles, that they were more likely in this experimental study, they were more likely to hire male participants and reject, or I should say male applicants and reject female applicants just because of internalizing the idea that the job that they are hiring for required intelligence or good intellectual ability. And so the conclusion was that in our society, intelligence and intellectual ability is associated with males, and in this context, leads males to have an advantage in hiring over females. When we know scientifically, or at least the leading psychological research would say that men and women do not differ in their overall intellectual abilities. This plays out in other aspects of our society. For example, in textbooks, there's been many studies to show that in various questions or examples that are used in textbooks of different age ranges for different levels of education, that the examples for what males and females do in these textbook questions or textbook examples are reinforcing certain gender stereotypes. So for example, males are depicted as driving motorcycles or cars, or doing really complex math problems, or doing or playing sports, or doing other activities that are traditionally viewed as male. And females in these books are described as doing more passive activities, or doing more things like things related to home care, such as cooking or baking, or doing more arts-related activities rather than scientific activities. And so early on in children's development in this country, there's a reinforced message of what gender roles should be for children, which aren't all evil, but may contribute to unequal outcomes later on in life, as we read in the previous study, where we associate certain qualities with being better for males and others for being for females, even when it's not scientifically true. And so I've made a distinct effort in our class to make sure that I use more female names for many of the quiz questions so that we can counter those messages. Another important form of prejudice and discrimination is ageism. Discrimination just based solely on a person's age. And typically when we refer to ageism, we're talking about individuals who are older in age, people who are viewed as too old for a particular job or too old to continue functioning at the level they were before, or assumptions about what a person's age means, that this person is old, therefore they're not good with technology. This person is old, therefore they're probably traditional and not willing to change. Those preconceived notions, those prejudices can result in real discrimination, particularly in the workforce. And there are many other forms of discrimination that we don't have time to go through in detail in this video. Discrimination based off of sexual orientation, homophobia, we often say. And I should mention that homophobia, it's not a true phobia in the same sense that is described in our previous chapter on mental illness in terms of arachnophobia or these other claustrophobia, these other phobias, these very real fears or anxieties. Homophobia refers to a larger, not just the interpersonal experience of fear of people of different or of same-sex attraction, but a larger societal forces and aspects of prejudice and discrimination towards individuals based solely on their sexual orientation. There's also ableism, discrimination and prejudices against people based on their mental or physical abilities, and other forms of discrimination that are important to mention. We'll spend the next video describing something more prevalent in society, the different terms and considerations related to racism.